Today we're going to talk about the residential purchase agreement. There are a number of purchase agreements in ZIM forms, commercial, residential income, bare land, so on and so forth. We have, in some cases, some addenda that can accompany a purchase agreement if you're doing a mobile home park or a probate purchase. We used to have special purchase agreements for both of those, and they did away with them. So now we just have an amendment, which makes it better, really. But
I'm just going to think Debbie is waiting to get in, so
okay.
if she pops up, just hit that.
What did he say? If she shows up?
If she pops up, just hit her name.
Oh. Okay, I don't think anybody's there. Okay, so we were saying a while ago, our purchase agreement, just like the listing agreement, comes bundled with the things that you're going to need that are, and the reason they come bundled now, they're mentioned in the purchase agreement that the buyer has already received these things and agreed to them. And so that's why they're in the order that they're in, one of the reasons. So just take them like they are. We've already talked about agency. Anybody have any questions on agency? Okay. Okay, so we won't go over that one. The next one down is a possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. I think that comes with your listing agreement too. And like we talked about before, we get all of these because there have been lawsuits. And when there's a lawsuit like this, if it hasn't established law itself through the appellate court, like we got the TDS and agency disclosure, the agency law, then CAR will sometimes make a form because of that lawsuit, and especially if there have been multiple lawsuits, to help keep us out of trouble, to help keep a consumer informed. So it serves a dual purpose. So unless you have a question on that possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, then we won't talk about that one either. And the one behind that is the wire fraud. That's also in the listing agreement. And it's just putting everybody on notice that wire fraud is a very real thing, and everybody needs to be especially careful.
Marsha, real quick, on the back on the possible more than one, where
Okay.
it says the DRE license number, would that be John's number, or it says buyer brokerage firm?
Yes.
So that's his number. we put
Yeah,
there.
that's his number.
Okay, got it.
And you can go ahead and put the company name in there and the company number. And if you want his broker's number, I'll give it to you.
Oh, no, I
It's
just
the
wondered
company.
because it just says it there.
Okay.
All right, making sure we get the right number in the right form.
Yes.
Well, if I put mine, that would be bad. I mean, when I get my license.
Yes. Yeah. And but that would be okay too.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So our next form then is our purchase agreement, and starting from the top, it's California Residential Purchase Agreement and Joint Escrow Instructions. Years ago, it used to say California Residential Purchase Agreement and Deposit Receipt. And when people gave us an earnest money deposit, that was their receipt for it. Then there was a big scam where people finally caught on. They could go around and make a lot of offers and kind of a bogus offer, but they kept using the same broker and moving that earnest money check forward to the next offer. And if that wasn't done properly, then they would come back and want a deposit back for each of those purchase agreements. And so then, of course, there were some lawsuits over that between brokers and those buyers, so on and so forth. And when they revised our purchase agreement again, they took the deposit receipt out. It no longer, and for one thing, time has evolved. We very seldom get the actual earnest money check. Sometimes we do. If we do, Debbie holds it. We make it out to title company. It isn't made out to our company trust account anymore for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons is when Debbie gets something that she does have to deposit, she has to log it in 5 different places and keep track of it in 5 different places to satisfy the DRE. And it's just a lot of work and liabilities. It goes straight to the title company now. Okay. This particular residential purchase agreement was revised last December, actually December 2018. So a year ago, we were supposed to be getting a new one this spring, and they've delayed it because of the coronavirus. And it apparently is going to be a few more pages. Isn't that fun?
Well, it's funny that you're saying that they're holding off on it, but they gave us 20 more documents
Yeah.
for the coronavirus, right?
That's right. Did you see the ones for yesterday?
I did. Yes, I did.
Yeah.
You should. Okay, there we go. Debbie, I think we got you.
Hi, Debbie.
Hello, here I am.
Oh, good. Good that you're there. We're doing the residential purchase agreement today.
Okay,
So you probably don't have a copy of that. Just take notes and listen, because you're probably going to hear all of this over again anyway.
okay, thank you.
Okay. Actually, Mitch is going to email a copy to you.
Okay, perfect.
It's okay. Mine has.
Is it? Okay. Okay. He'll email that to you and it'll be on its way in just a minute. So we're on page 1 of the purchase agreement, and again, it's got the California Association of Realtors logo on the left side. And very important is the date prepared up at the top left-hand corner. That date prepared, again, is a reference date for when you have counteroffers, an addendum, an amendment, anything like that that refers back to the purchase agreement dated. It's not the date that anybody signed it, it's this date prepared. It's just a reference date, okay? But a lot of people get very confused about that because a lot of people leave it blank and don't have a clue what its real purpose is. But now you're among the clued in. Okay, this is an offer from, and you want to list the names of all of the buyers that are going to be on title. And sometimes you have to ask. We have a lot of cultures in this area that do things differently because of their culture. As an example, there's a couple of cultures at least that the men go out and look at property, don't take the women. At the very end of escrow, just before closing, they may or may not decide to put their wives on title. It opens up a lot of liability if they put somebody on title at the very end of escrow and they haven't agreed to the purchase agreement or the disclosures, that kind of thing. So then we have to scramble and try to get all of that taken care of so that it doesn't leave the sellers or the agents or the brokerage out on a limb. Okay, so that's why, and if it is one of those cultures that doesn't take women out to look, then ask them right away, is there anybody else that's going to be on title with you? Sometimes people don't know. Sometimes they'll get started in the process of getting a loan and they will find out that your credit scores are too low or there's this situation or that problem, and the lender wants them to get a co-borrower in order to purchase the property. So then they have to bring somebody on. A lot of times just the opposite happens. You've got two people that are buying a house together and they both are qualifying for the loan through their own credit history and their own social security number, finds out that one of them really doesn't qualify for a loan because their credit score is too low. So this could seem like a real problem for, let's say, a married couple where they both want to be on title, they want to own this, they're both going to be paying for it, so on and so forth. But the lender says you have to get that person off. They can't be on title because they don't qualify for the loan. Well, you can put them on title. They may not be on the loan. The only problem that exists then is that if anything should happen to the person that is on the loan, the lender will probably call that loan due, or they would have to refinance at that point. Let's say somebody was killed in a car crash or something just all of a sudden, and that was the person on the loan. The other person would have to refi and be able to qualify for the loan or sell the property. So there's some consequences to that, but certainly they can have a title interest in the property without being on the loan. Okay. So we want to get everybody's name, and you want the name, what their full name is. Let's say their name is Catherine, and they go by Kathy, and everybody calls them Kathy or Kate or whatever. And they've been signing all of the purchase documents as Kathy. And they get to escrow, and escrow says, how do you want to hold title? My name is Catherine Ann whatever, and that's how I want to hold title. The lender doesn't like it when the names don't match, even if one is a shortened or a pet version of the other. Okay, so ask them, I need the name the way that you're going to hold title. If their legal name is Kathy and not Catherine, Kathy's fine. But if it's Catherine and probably whatever they have on their driver's license probably is going to be the way that escrow wants them to hold title.
I know, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Russ asked me a question today.
Oh, he asked you that question?
Yeah, we were talking about it earlier, that's nothing you usually ask about.
Yeah.
I was guessing, but once your government, when it comes to Marsha, that's wrong.
Not always. Okay. Okay. So we have an offer from all of the buyers, and the real property to be acquired is, and after that is follows the street address. So if it's 123 Elm Street or whatever that street address is, that's where you put that. And followed by the city, the county, California, and the zip code. You want to have all of that information in there. And then you want to make sure that you get the assessor's parcel number in there. If you're downloading, when you make out your zip forms, and this is what we talked about yesterday, Noe, when you're going to make out the purchase agreement, you can connect with the MLS and it will download all of the information from that listing into your zip form cover sheet, which then populates all of these documents that we're working on. You assume that the information coming in is correct, and I think in most cases it is, but always you're going to pull up the tax sheet when you prepare a purchase agreement anyway. Compare the APN that is on the tax sheet with the one that's in the MLS. And if they differ, I probably would go with the tax sheet because people do make mistakes. And you would think that escrow would verify, but sometimes things get messed up in escrow too, because they're only human and the human factor does come in and there are mistakes that are made sometimes. We've had situations where the wrong APN went on for several years and then somebody wanted to sell that property and the property they were trying to sell wasn't if they were going by the APN, and you can see what kind of a problem that would be. Liens and judgments and all kinds of things get recorded against a property by the APN. And if those things collect on a wrong APN, it can be a real difficult situation. That doesn't happen too often, but it only takes one time, especially if it's a number of years later. The one we had was 7 years later, and it took some doing to undo. Okay, so just verify the assessor's parcel number, and then the purchase price offered is, and whatever purchase price you and your buyer have discussed that they're going to offer goes there. And a little tip, when you are doing your cover sheet and you're putting the figures in the cover sheet that are going to populate into your purchase agreement, if you put your numerical figures in, it will write in the words. Like if you're writing 250,000, if you put the 250 numerically, it will figure all of that out and type in the words 250,000 for you, which makes it very nice. Okay. The purchase price offered is whatever it's going to be, and then close of escrow shall occur on, and you've got a choice between a date or so many days after acceptance. By the time you're making an offer, your buyer should be well into the approval process on their loan, because you're going to have to attach a letter stating that they've been pre-approved, and maybe you've got an approval from them hinging on an accepted offer and an appraisal. That's your best case. So your closing date, you can have a discussion with the lender and ask the lender, we're going to make an offer on this property today for these buyers. Do you think you're going to be ready to close in 30 days? How many days should we make this purchase for? If they've been through the process of getting pre-approved, it shouldn't take too long for a lender to finish the job. It can get held up in underwriting sometimes, but even your loan officer isn't going to know that until they get to that point. So the loan officer will give you a good idea. I think I can get this done easily in 30 days, maybe even sooner. Kathy, our loan officer back there, quite frequently gets them done early. And if all parties are willing to close early, then you can go ahead and close if the seller's moved out and everything's ready to go.
So if you put like 30-day escrow, but if you close sooner, it's okay, right?
It's okay, yes. It has to be approved by both parties. If the buyer's ready to go, let's say that it was a 45-day escrow on the purchase agreement and the seller's still occupying the house and the loan gets finished in 30 days and the seller says, I just can't be out, I can't close it any sooner than 45 days, then you can't close early. But as long as everybody's in agreement, and usually sellers will try their best to accommodate a buyer, it's early to close, better to close something early than late. But sometimes it just has to be worked out. So it depends. If you have a date that has to be, you have to close it on a certain date. Maybe the buyer is selling a house and that escrow isn't closing until June 15th, and they want to do a concurrent closing. So you might have a date on there instead of so many days from the accepted offer for the closing. That's why you've got a choice there. If you have a 1031 exchange, you may have a date there that you absolutely have to close it by no later than, otherwise they run into tax consequences on a 1031 if they can't close on time sometimes. Okay. But usually, after you talk to your lender, it's going to be generally about 30 days, maybe 45 days. In some cases, on a VA loan, it could be up to 60. It just depends on who that lender is and where they are in the process. If you have any possibility of directing a buyer and where they're getting a loan, first of all, we've got the best right here with Kathy and our company. But if you are working with a buyer that got online and got tied up with somebody, the biggest problems come from these online lenders from out of the area, and especially if they're out of state. If it's an out of state online lender, they have to be licensed in California in order to do a loan here. So you have to ask that question first if they just insist on going through. But truly, if we're going to have a problem with a loan, it's usually through one of those online lenders from out of the area. Okay. Well, they have to be licensed here in California. Let's say they're a lender in New Jersey. A lot of those online lenders will be licensed all over the country. They have to get a license for every state they want to do loans in. But if they haven't done that and they aren't licensed here in California, then they're just wasting everybody's time and money, and they should be upfront about that. And for the most part nowadays, in the past, we've had some problems where we get almost up to the end and find out they aren't licensed in California, and it's a problem. Hi, Sarita. So it's a question to ask. Are you licensed in California? But if you can get them into Kathy where we can take care of that loan here in-house, the process goes so much better, so much smoother. And if there's a situation, we keep talking about the power and the credit that John Sr. has all over town with lenders too. If we're doing a loan here in-house and we hit a stumbling block and it looks like it's going to be tough going, John can review the situation, get online with that lending source that we're dealing through, and more often than not make it happen just because of who he is. And that has a lot to do with just being able to do business here. I think it's a great thing. Okay. Well, I think E is an important statement. It says buyer and seller are referred to herein as the parties. Brokers are not parties to this agreement. So what does that really mean? Brokers are not parties. We're not the ones buying or selling, right? We aren't the decision maker. We can be the advisor, but we're not going to make the decision for somebody on what they should do. We're going to fill up that buffet table full of all of the information that we need to help them make a good decision. Might need to nudge them or help them, but ultimately it's not our decision. So we're not a party to. Okay. And then agency, we've talked about agency. We've got the disclosure Remember, in California, agency is in three parts: the disclosure, the selection or election, and then the confirmation. We usually don't know until we're writing up a purchase agreement who the agent is representing the seller. So when we're writing up the purchase agreement, we know then who's representing the seller, and that is our guide to making the confirmation, which is part B here. It's got the seller's brokerage firm, and then below that is the buyer's brokerage firm. And because in this instance we're representing the buyer, then it's Century 21C Watson represents the buyer, and you always have to make sure you get a check mark in one of those boxes. Either we're representing the buyer, or if we're representing both the buyer and the seller and we're a dual agent, then we have to have a check mark. If you get in the seller's line the brokerage firm and the agent, and the same for our line, but you forget to put an X in the box, then I have to reject that confirmation and have you do it all over again, because this isn't signifying, it's not identifying who actually is representing whom. So we have to actually have those boxes checked.
Do all you mean just this page?
Well, no, there's a special form. If it isn't done right, there's a special form called an agency confirmation form, and it's just one page that kind of goes over who's representing the buyer and who's representing the seller, and they just drag it out into a full page. But if there aren't check marks there, then that's what we have to do. Okay, because, and this is probably a good place to say this, once a purchase agreement has been prepared and signed by the buyer, nobody can make changes to it. Every once in a while, let's say you've prepared this form before you take it to your buyer because you've talked about what you're going to do, and you've just gone back to the office to make up the purchase agreement. You get back with the buyer, and the buyer says, you know, I've had a change of heart. I think I want to increase my earnest money deposit. I've got $1,000 there. Can we just mark that out and put $1,500 there, or $2,000 instead of my $1,000? I think it's going to look better to the seller. You haven't sent it over to the seller yet. You're working with your buyers. So yes, in that case, put one line through it, and above it put the corrected amount, and then have your buyer's initial. Okay. I see things from time to time that are written on a counteroffer or an addendum with no initials there. Can't really accept that until it's initialed by somebody, because I don't know who hand wrote it in there. I don't know if an agent wrote it in, if a seller wrote it in, if a buyer did later on. Unless it's initialed, that's the indication, and that's the only way that I can accept it. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Okay. And then potentially keep competing buyers and sellers. We've got that form, the PRBS, that we've talked about, and it's checked here stating that the buyer has already received that and signed it. And then finance terms. Buyer represents that funds will be good when deposited with escrow holder. So that's putting them on notice. You got to have the money in the bank. You can't write a check with insufficient funds and give it to somebody. If you're going to do that, if they're going to do that and they say, hold this, then you have to let the seller know those funds will be in the bank tomorrow, and I would probably put that in the purchase agreement here under other terms. Seller will have earnest money funds in the bank by Tuesday, March 2nd or whatever. Okay. So their initial deposit, the buyer direct deposit, the buyer shall deliver the deposit directly to escrow holder by electronic funds transfer, cashier's check, personal check, or other. Nobody will take cash, and we don't like to take cash either. If somebody brings in, let's say they're here on a Sunday afternoon, and they bring $500 in cash that they want to use as their earnest money deposit. If we take cash, we have to make a copy of both the front and the back, and that's actually against the law. So we don't like to take cash. We don't like to be responsible for it. It probably would be better to tell that buyer to deliver to escrow, and they won't take cash either. They don't want the cash. They like to get a cashier's check. For an earnest money check, they can take a personal check because it's usually going to be more than 2 weeks before the closing. They have to allow 2 weeks for a check to close. Okay, they can, as long as the closing's 2 weeks out. And most of the time they are. So how much earnest money do we put up? Have you had anything in your classes that talked about how much earnest money should be?
Is it like agree between both parties?
It can be, but we're going to have a long discussion about earnest money, and part of it has to do with liquidated damages. So I'll give you a little bit of it now, and then later on when we get back to page 7 or 8, whatever it is, we're going to talk long and hard about liquidated damages and what that actually means. In this area, generally, an acceptable deposit is about 1% of the purchase price, okay? So it doesn't have to be exact, but it should be close. And we never use pennies. We never use change in the change column after the decimal point. We're dealing in round figures. So let's say you're making an offer of $249,500. Do you need an earnest money check of $2,400 and what would it be? 90, can't even remember what I said now, but $95? No, you can make it an earnest money check, $2,500, $2,400, probably $2,000 would be acceptable. $500 probably would not be acceptable. Okay. You have some agents around town that get really, really funny when they look at a purchase agreement and they want that earnest money to be 1%. There's nothing written anywhere about how much an earnest money deposit has to be. There is a lot written about the consequences of what the amount is, and that's what we're going to talk about in liquidated damages. But for right now, about 1%. Can they put more down? Sometimes, and there used to be a theory that the more you could get a buyer to put down, the more they felt obligated to buy the property. That might be well and good in one sense, but there is consumer protection on 1 to 4 units. If the buyer is going to live in one of those units, there's more consumer protection. And when we get into liquidated damages, it talks about any amount over 3%. A seller cannot keep if the buyer is going to live in one of those 1 to 4 units. That's consumer protection for the buyer. So if the buyer's going to live in it, and he can put as much as he wants to, but what he's jeopardizing is 3%. Let's say that the buyer is an investor buyer. They're not going to live in it, and they're going to put down earnest money of 10%. It's going to be a cash deal anyway. They want to put down 10% because they want to make the offer look good. Because they're not going to live in one of those units, their consumer protection isn't as great. What they have done is jeopardize the whole 10%, not just 3%. Okay. Later on, we'll talk more about that and go into great detail about.
Let's say the house is 500,000, so we put like 4,000.
Sure, they could put 4,000. They could put 4,000 or whatever.
2,500.
Yeah, something like that. And when the seller gets the purchase agreement, that seller has to make a decision. And a lot of times that decision is based upon what his agent is telling him. This earnest money is less than 1%. Everybody knows they have to have 1%. So it's the influence of that agent a lot of times that will say to a seller, we need to ask for at least 1%. Most experienced agents will say, that's close enough, let's just go with it. Because the chances, if that buyer backs out, of the seller keeping that money is usually fairly slim. So, and we'll talk more about that too when we get to liquidated damages. So yeah, it's whatever the seller would accept, so on and so forth. Okay. Okay. Okay, it says in 3A, we did 1, and then number 2, buyer deposit with agent. Buyer has given the deposit to the company representing them to hold. Here's the situation. If your buyer is going to write a check for the earnest money and you're sitting there while they write that check, you're really supposed to bring that check back and give it to Debbie. And if you touch it at all, we have to have it. Okay? So have a discussion with your buyer. If they're going to write a check and they want to take it directly to escrow, then have them take it as soon as the offer is accepted. If they write a check and you get it in your possession, you hold it, then you have to bring it back. Debbie has to log it in, but have it made out to title company. And then as soon as the offer is accepted, then she will forward that check to the title company, the appropriate title company. Okay. And she'll just give the title company a call. They all have couriers, and they'll come and pick it up at the front desk. So anymore, we actually have a written company policy about earnest money checks and how to handle them. But in truth, anymore, most people, most agents are directing that buyer to wire transfer it in or take it direct. And part of the reason for that is because the young people nowadays don't use checks. And a lot of them don't even have checks. So it's hard to get a check from somebody that doesn't have one, and so on and so forth. And if they can take it direct to escrow, what this does to you as an agent, whether you're the buyer's agent or the seller's agent, we've got 3 days to get the earnest money into escrow once the offer is accepted. no matter who you represent, you have to make sure that that money is there. Because as soon as the offer is accepted, that earnest money is being held in trust, no matter where it is, for the seller. It actually belongs to the seller, conditioned upon some things happening. You know, there's contingencies that will protect that earnest money. For one thing, they've got a 17-day due diligence time period to make any discoveries that allows them to back out. They may have other contingencies too. Those contingencies protect that earnest money for the duration of the contingency, so that if the buyer has to back out because of that, they get their earnest money back. And the seller really has no say about that. Once the due diligence time period is over, once the buyer has removed their contingencies, the only difference is that earnest money then is in jeopardy. If that buyer backs out, unprotected by a contingency, that seller can say, I want that earnest money. I believe that I've been injured through this process for whatever reason, and they may get to keep it. Okay, it's not automatic though, as we're going to see later, where it talks about the earnest money. It's not automatic.
So the buyer, so I thought you were saying like that's not the same way to do it.
Yeah, it's done a lot because it's a convenient way for money to get from point A to point B. As long as people are being careful about where they get their instructions and the wiring numbers and so on and so forth, then we do that a lot. The wire transfer. It's just an accepted method. But we have to let people know, and that's what that wire transfer advisory is, that if they get numbers, routing numbers through an email, even perhaps over the phone, they may not be legitimate numbers, because these people that are hackers are masters at being able to get into other people's email and so on and so forth, and change those routing numbers. So the best thing for a buyer to do is to go sit directly in front of the escrow officer and get those numbers direct. Or if they're getting an email from escrow, they need to call and verify those numbers. And it's going to be up to the buyer to verify, because there's no way that we can or should. We just have to warn them that there is danger.
We advise them like the best way is to go in, or if they say, well, it's okay, you know, I'm just gonna talk on the phone, that's up to them, right?
Yes.
You know, now the agent is not reliable if something happens without your advice.
As long as you haven't given the numbers out or changed the numbers, and as long as you give them this wire fraud advisory form here, telling them that that there's danger involved, then no, you shouldn't be and can't be held liable as long as you followed the correct procedure. Yeah. Okay. There's also a common misconception about earnest money, because it says that the buyer shall deliver the deposit directly to escrow within 3 business days after acceptance. And sometimes buyers go home and they sleep on it that night, and they come back and they think, what was I thinking? We can't afford this house, or I like that house, but I really need a 3-car garage and not a 2-car garage. I think we should wait until that 3 card comes along. Whatever their thinking is, the next day people, not often, but every once in a while will cancel an offer. Or before that 3 days is up, they'll cancel the contract. And I will get a cancellation, and on that cancellation, it says no money in escrow, meaning there is no earnest money because it was never in escrow. That's the furthest thing from the truth. The very instant that this offer is ratified either by the seller or by either party on a counteroffer, there's an acceptance that earnest money exists, and it exists for the benefit of the seller. Okay, so if there is a cancellation, I can't cancel the file unless there's dispensation of that earnest money. Seller has to release it, buyer has to release it, or they have to have a mutual agreement about how they're going to divide it up. An escrow officer, a real estate broker, a real estate agent cannot make a decision about who gets that money. Only the buyer and the seller can make that decision. And if they can't reach an agreement, then one of the parties has to file a small claims court action, and they have to go to court, plead their situation with the judge, and the judge will make a decision about who gets it. Here's the thing about the earnest money. In most cases, unless the party wanting the money, well, usually the seller. If the seller wants that money and the buyer won't release it and they take it to court, that seller has to be able to show evidence to the judge that he's been injured somehow. The property is worth less money because it's a declining market. He's got invoices for things he had to do at the request of the buyer that were things requested on the purchase agreement, that kind of thing. He has to show that he's been injured. Okay, so that's usually sort of hard to do. And if another offer is accepted and they're moving toward a close, the judge is probably going to say there is no injury here. Give the money back. Okay. So, but it depends. You never know when you get into a courtroom what the judge is going to do or how they're going to respond. Most of the time they have to take it all into consideration, and they'll give you a decision by mail within so many weeks or days or whatever. Okay. So this may be a question on the test. I don't know. Well, just what I'm going to say now. Do you have to have an earnest money deposit to have a legal contract? You don't.
I knew that was wrong. I shook my head.
No, you don't. You don't have to have earnest money to have a legal contract. All it's showing is an interest from the buyer, and he's trying to show how great that interest is by putting up an earnest money deposit. But there doesn't have to be. That's not an element of a legal contract. Okay. So they might have on the test what the elements are of a legal contract. Do you know? Do you remember? Capacity, consideration. I'm sorry?
A capable party?
Yes, that would be capacity.
Yeah.
Can't be crazy, have to be over 18. Or 18 or over.
Acknowledgement?
I'm sorry, Debbie? Didn't hear you.
I'm sorry, acknowledgement, is that part of it?
It is acknowledgement. Yes, somebody has to sign it, right? So it has to be agreed upon. So capacity, consideration, there has to be a time date for all of this to take place.
Accepted.
Which would be the acknowledgement. What are we missing? I don't even know what we're missing. Yeah, it does have to be in writing. Maybe that's it. A real estate transaction has to be in writing unless it's an agreement on commissions between brokers. Uh-huh.
I'm kind of get confused. Is it did I learn from Ted? Is it the contact element? I think it's that, right? S T I V.
Well, there has to be an object that you're selling. So there has to be a what do you call it? A property, I guess. Huh? Okay. Okay. In B, it says increased deposit. Buyer shall deposit with escrow holder an increased deposit in the amount of whatever within so many days after acceptance. If the parties agree to liquidated damages in this agreement, they also agree to incorporate the increased deposit in the liquidated damages amount in a separate liquidated damages clause, the CAR form RID, and at the time the increased deposit is delivered to escrow. So I actually have an ongoing feud with other companies. I think I'm right. They think they're right. I can't remember if I've ever talked to John about this. I can't imagine that I haven't. About the receipt for increased deposit. My feeling is anytime there's an increase that is beyond this first line here, you have to use that RID form. And they will argue with me all day long that if it's in the counteroffer, you don't need the RID form. I say if it's anything beyond what's here, because even in the counteroffer, you haven't negotiated liquidated damages on that increase.
Okay, so the RID form also addresses the liquidated damage issue.
Yes.
Um,
And that's really the whole purpose of that form.
I don't know how to answer you absolutely. I know we talked about this, and I'm thinking that if it's in the negotiating stage and we don't have a contract, the counter says, make the initial deposit 5,000 instead of 1,000. I might defer to them because you may not have to have a RID.
Really?
Well, there is no contract.
There is no contract, but you're
negotiating
being,
the contract. So what you've done is you negotiated all the elements of that contract. One of those elements is the
but there's no negotiating there unless you put it in the counteroffer. They're not, and I very, very seldom see that done where they're talking about whether that's a part of liquidated damages.
I think the problem would have to be together. They'd have to identify that. That may be true. So I'm not.
Okay, because here's the thing. Let's say that seller wants it to be over 3%, and you haven't negotiated liquidated damages,
Okay.
and
We'll
it's,
open up another issue. So it's possible. Please say, use an RID. I gotta think of it.
make me happy and you'll be,
That's exactly right.
That's right.
That's part of what you want to do. And it certainly, even if it isn't absolutely necessary, it's certainly good, it would be good policy to be able to have. So you know,
Yes.
everyone. There's no question
yes,
about how that increased deposit is
Right.
being treated.
And it shows intent. And in truth, most people don't have a clue what that's about on there, and it's totally ignored, but at least it's done. John, do you have an opinion?
I probably got in on the lake farm. Talking about
Yes. On a counter offer.
Yeah. You like it taken care of on paper.
Yes, with that RID form.
Yeah. That's better, so. I'll put it this way, you know. That contract's gonna get to March of the 14th. Back in March, it's through with it, it doesn't need to be. So if she tells you she needs it, and that's, the last time we had a lawsuit around here, not even a small claim. So if we do have to go, Marsha's gonna have a file and she's got that ready. We don't see it now. I think,
No, no,
but we see it every now and then, and I know you've required that for a long time, so
yeah.
I certainly don't have a problem. I'd rather have it.
The last time we went to court, we had to go twice with that guy from Oral Financial, and we won. And that's the one Joanne has an escrow now
This
with.
guy used to be the city council.
Yeah.
Oh, biggest pile of garden. Oh, you're talking about, has the mortgage.
Matias or
Matisse.
Matisse.
Chris Matisse.
Chris Matisse.
Oh, you look at that. Yeah, you dealt with him when you were in the,
Yeah. He's,
you know where Glasgow around here. Oh, yeah. You get two sides of it. I'm so proud of John, he decided to get him. I saw the lights, I went to the dark side. To the light. I
oh,
just thought I'd sit down there and have a chance to talk to you guys. Oh, you're waiting for a license. I got it, you got your done. Okay, and you're waiting for a deputy. Have you been able to get? John, you're.
Still not open? Did you log in online to see?
No, I didn't.
Why the heck didn't you?
But you said I have to wait.
No. Oh, that's right, I'm sorry. I keep getting messed up. She just submitted her combo app.
That's why he left the state, he's got the interview.
I do.
Yeah, geez.
I keep wanting you to be all done with that and we're waiting for the deadline. You haven't started yet. So. You just
No, I
made your
just,
application.
we have so many people that really get frustrated because we want you to have a license probably as much as you.
You know,
Okay. This pandemic or whatever we have. It's really growing.
Dominic just got his yesterday.
oh, did he?
He got his license, right?
Yeah, yesterday.
Oh,
Yeah.
good.
He got issued yesterday. They found it on the computer.
Hopefully we get freed up because business. Is going good.
Mhm.
That's for sure, a lot of 20,000 local, that's total. This is stolen costs, because it's really low. And you wrote a real nice letter. Then he got married.
Yeah. He's very busy.
So. Ernest had at least one a week.
Yeah.
Ernest kind of stayed sheltered and watched it. You know,
Mhm.
of course, at Ernest's age.
President San Diego,
Don't get around.
June 14th, they'll open up the events.
Oh, June 14th?
And June
Oh,
30th for the rest of the stuff.
Yeah. Wonder how far they'll be backlogged.
Probably a lot, because I got a sneaky feeling we're gonna do half capacity so that you have a examiner, that's vacant desk
Yes.
and then another examiner, so that you want to have half capacity, which is about 15.
So they still didn't want to stay back.
Yeah, I took over the franchise tax board space. It's all, well, not all of the particles for my auditors, but most of it is for the Terry account.
My broker's license, I have to
I do too. And the convention center,
Long time ago.
do the convention center.
I don't remember what I did.
I do.
Really going,
Have
that is,
thousands.
Hmm.
They had rows and rows and rows of tables, man. It was
yeah, I think I used to,
yeah, probably
72.
That's what I did.
Okay, ladies, fascinating as that all is.
Reminiscent of the old school.
I just so hope you did.
Okay, if it's an all cash offer, then you would check the box there that it's all cash. No loan is needed to purchase the property. This offer is not contingent on buyer obtaining a loan. Written verification of sufficient funds to close this transaction is attached to this offer, or buyer shall within 3 days after acceptance deliver to seller such verification. So what they're looking for there is just to know what well, not the lender, because the lender's not going to be seeing that, but the seller wants to know that there actually is really enough cash. And if it's an all cash offer, doesn't really matter where it comes from. They don't have to verify that it's seasoned money or whatever. It's just cash and the seller's getting cash. Okay. What if somebody wanted to make a purchase and they wanted to give the seller a bag full of diamonds? Could the seller take that? Doesn't happen too often like that. Okay.
You definitely did that to,
Take them down and have
That make
them.
me nervous right off the bat.
Yeah.
This is all off the record here, what the?
You need somebody that could verify they were
real.
genuine. Yeah,
Oh, yeah,
yeah.
that's definitely escrow.
Okay, first loan in the amount of, the loan will be conventional financing unless you have checked one of these other boxes for an FHA, a VA, or seller financing. Then there's a box for assumed financing, but we have a policy in our company that if it's going to be assumed financing, that needs to be handled by an attorney, because most lenders aren't allowing a buyer to assume a loan. If they do assume it, they have to still qualify for it, and they may even raise the interest rate up to whatever the current interest rate is. So it's better for a buyer just to go out and get their own loan. We used to have loans that were assumed, and we call them all-inclusive trust deeds or a wrap. We did this back in the 80s when the interest rates were so high and people had equity in their property, and a buyer would assume their loan, and if they did a wrap on it or an all-inclusive, the lender didn't know, wasn't told, and lenders decided that they didn't like that, and now they've got language in the notes that they make that you can't do that kind of thing. So we used to have an agent here. She died a few years ago, but she did a lot of those. She had some old-time investors that she worked with, and she still would do those, but she had to go through a certain escrow officer that she worked with. That's the only one John would let her know. You need to have an attorney involved, because we don't want to be liable when they call that note due and the problems that may exist. Okay. We do have sellers that will carry a note. If a seller has a property that's free and clear, Or maybe it has a huge amount of equity and a very small payoff. And if that buyer comes in with enough cash to cover all the closing costs, including paying off the loan and the commission, then that seller may decide that carrying a loan is a good thing for the seller. A lot of people will have income properties, and as a part of their retirement plan, they want to sell off some of those properties and carry the notes on them as a part of their strategy. So that can be a good thing for some people. And if they've got a lot of equity and they're not going to do anything with that money, they're not going to do it a 1031 exchange, they're just going to put the money in the bank, they're probably better off lending that money to the buyer rather than putting it in the bank. Because is there any bank that pays even a percent of interest anymore? Probably not. Where usually if a seller is going to carry the loan, it's going to be at least the going rate and sometimes a little bit higher, because in most cases that seller is doing the buyer a favor by carrying that loan. It's not as hard to qualify, so on and so forth. If a seller is going to carry, if his strategy is income for a long time, he may make it a 30-year loan. But a lot of times sellers don't like to get into long-term loans for a number of reasons. And they may say, I will amortize this loan over 30 years to keep the payments low, but I'll give you 5 years or 7 years or 10 years. They'll pick a number to give you time to get yourself situated and to refinance this property later on. And that could be an advantage for a buyer. Could be a disadvantage if interest rates go way up. They may not be able to qualify. So if you ever do a seller financing loan, there is an addendum. Come to me anytime you're going to do one of those and I'll help you with it, because after you've been through it a time or two, it isn't a difficult form, but the first time or two, it can catch you in a couple of places. So I just like to help you to make sure that it's done properly. Okay? Okay. A second loan, we used to do a lot of second loans. I don't think they do them much anymore. It used to be on conventional financing, you needed to have 20% down. And if people weren't walking around with 20% in the bank, they may have been stuck. And a lot of times if a seller had equity, he might carry 10%. The buyer would come in with 10% down, and the buyer would still be able to get a conventional loan at a good rate because they had 20% down. We just don't see that much anymore. It could be done, I guess. I don't know. And then in number 3, FHA, VA. For any FHA or VA loan, the buyer has 17 days after acceptance to deliver to seller a written notice of any lender required repairs or costs that buyer requests seller to pay for or otherwise correct. Seller has no obligation to pay or satisfy lender requirements unless agreed in writing. And an FHA, VA, a mandatory clause form shall be a part of this agreement. If you check up above in number D1 that it's going to be FHA or VA, these forms are supposed to automatically pop up and populate in zip forms for you. I'm not sure that they always do, but they're supposed to. So one of them is a form that if the lender does require something for that seller to fix or repair, that you give that form back to the seller, and then they can make a decision once they know what it is and how much the cost is going to be about whether they're going to do that or not do that. The amendatory clause always has room for the price to be inserted on a blank line, whatever that selling price is, and it has to do with the appraisal. If the appraisal falls short of the selling price, then there are basically three things that can happen. And this amendatory clause is saying that they have to make a decision then about what is going to happen. Either the buyer can come in with more cash, the seller can reduce the price, or they can agree to just walk away and cancel. Okay, so it depends. A lot of times buyers don't have the money to pay the difference between a low appraisal and the asking price or the selling price. And even if they do, they may decide that that's not a wise decision for them. So options there. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, if there are any additional financing terms, a lot of times agents will put on that line something to the effect of seller shall pay 3% of purchase price towards buyer's recurring and non-recurring closing costs. Or maybe they'll have a flat amount. They'll just say, this buyer has everything that they need, except they need $1,500. So they'll say, seller to pay $1,500 at closing towards buyer's recurring and non-recurring closing costs. Okay. That doesn't happen on every transaction, but we still see it from time to time. Okay. Balance of the down payment. People get the balance of the down payment and the earnest money confused. The earnest money is just showing good faith. In this area, it's usually about 1%, like we talked about. The balance of the down payment is going to be the purchase price minus their loan, and then you have to factor in their earnest money, and that's going to tell you what the balance of their down payment is.
So purchase price minus loan and
Uh-huh,
minus the earnest.
uh-huh. Will give you what the cash that they're going to need to take to escrow. And let's talk just for a moment about when they should take that money to escrow. This is my opinion again, and there's no right or wrong to it. It's just my opinion based on what I've seen over a few years in the business. I think that buyers should take that money in as late into the escrow as they can. The earnest money has to be there in 3 days. The balance of the purchase price, I would say take in toward the end of escrow. Because if a title company is going to close for any reason, and a buyer has money in there at the time that they close, that money can be held up for some time. So many, many years ago, John, do you remember Winfield Title?
What?
Winfield Title?
No, it's not.
Okay, Winfield Title was a title company, an escrow company over San Luis County. Yeah, and one day they just closed up, and people that had money in that, and I don't know what the circumstances were with that, but on some of those it took a year to get that money out of escrow, and some of them just got a percentage of what they had in. It was a very hard thing for some people. A few years ago, we had a title company back here, I can't remember. Oh, Financial Title. Uh-huh. And I don't know what happened to them, But usually when a title company closes, the US Marshals will come in about 5 o'clock and say, pick up your personal possessions and leave the building right now. Don't report to work tomorrow. Take nothing with you except your very personal effects. And they do that to keep money from disappearing or whatever. And but when Financial Title knew that they were going to be closed, they had made arrangements with First American to take over their accounts, and it was a smooth transfer for whatever the reason was. And I don't know of any delays beyond just a few days, and as far as I know, nobody lost any money. But my reason for saying not to take money into an escrow until the very end is because if there is something that could happen, the later that it gets there, the safer the money is, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, once it goes in, escrow, even though it came from the buyer, escrow, when the buyer demands it back, escrow won't give it back. So if there's a dispute, if something happens, you involve the party, the very 11th hour, and the buyer put all their deposit funds in, they're gonna have to fight to get it back, unless the seller agrees to authorize escrow to release those funds back to the buyer.
Yeah.
So it can be a problem, so Mark's right, I think you can wait until then. And typically, when you do a wire transfer, you're gonna have a cashier's check or something, there within a day or two.
Mm-hmm.
I think even on, wire transfer, they still wait what? They still wait 24 hours?
They probably do.
Yeah.
I don't know how it is now with wire transfers, but years ago, if it was coming from overseas, well, now if it comes from overseas, it has to pass Homeland Security, and that can be a delay. But it used to be every time it passed over a Federal Reserve District, there was a delay. I don't know if that is still true, but I had a closing years ago that the money came from the East Coast, and it took us almost a week to get that money past all of those Federal Reserve districts.
For the most part, what we're dealing with is somebody going down to the bank, to get a cashier's check or something. For the balance of the fund. Usually, you're not talking 50% or 70% of the purchase price, you're talking about full balance portion, 70%, 80, or even 90%, is very little upfront additional upfront, that would be deposit or security deposit.
Yeah.
That can be handled using the cashier's.
Yes. The banks for closing costs like that will only take a cashier's check. If it's not a wire transfer, they will only take a cashier's check, and it has to be drawn on a California chartered bank. Otherwise, they have to hold it again. So,
You'll always remind your clients that no wait until the 11th hour and 55 minutes before they at least enough to allow a day or two so that you can, that's something there's so I have to so close as the schedule.
yeah. Okay. And then the total purchase price is just reiterated again at the bottom, and you just want to make sure all of your figures total up to be what the purchase price is. That's bottom line should agree with your purchase price up at the top, and it's all just a matter of math. Any questions on page 1? Okay. Flip it over on page 2. Most of these things at the top of the page here are going to be taken care of because you're going to come with this purchase agreement. You're going to have your loan document, not your loan document, you're going to have your verification letter, so on and so forth. But it says verification of down payment and closing costs, buyers or buyer's lender within 3 days after acceptance will verify that. If they have been to their lender and they have a loan approval, that's what the lender has done. They've already verified employment. They've already verified funds in the banks, so on and so forth. So, and the appraisal contingency, this agreement is or is not contingent upon a written appraisal of the property. There's some misconception that I hear floating around, if the offer is cash, that there won't be an appraisal. Well, there won't be a lender appraisal, but a buyer always has the right to get an appraisal on a property. And if they're from out of the area, or they haven't bought many properties, or they don't know a lot about the value in an area, it's a good idea for a cash buyer to get an appraisal to feel good about what they're paying for that property. And they have every right to do that, no matter what an agent may tell them. Okay. All right, loan terms, the loan application, here again, they've got 3 days to get that application in. But if they don't submit with their offer an approval letter, they don't have much of a chance in today's market of getting it accepted. All of this changed when we went through the REO mess that we did from 2006 or 7 for about the next 8 or 9 years. Now everybody expects when an offer is submitted that it has a letter from a lender attached to it. Okay, so it takes away a lot of what you need to do here. The loan contingency, the buyer is going to act diligently toward getting that loan, and the loan contingency removal is for 21 days. So 21 days after acceptance, buyer shall, as specified in paragraph 14 in writing, remove the loan contingency or cancel this agreement. They've got a choice. If for some reason they can't provide that loan approval and they need to be ready at that point, getting close to drawing docks, needs to be a pretty sound deal. If things are not looking good, then they can cancel. Or if there was a little glitch or a delay in something and they need a little more time, they can always request an extension of time for this. The loan contingency is different from the amount of days for the other contingencies, okay? The others are 17 days. We'll see that in paragraph 4, but for the loan, it's 21 days. Okay. If there is no loan contingency in 4, obtaining any loan specified above is not a contingency of this agreement. If buyer does not obtain the loan and as a result does not purchase the property, seller may be entitled to buyer's deposit or other legal remedies. I mostly could see a buyer checking that if they're trying to be super competitive. There are a lot of offers. It's a very tight market. They're trying to make their offer look as good as possible. And so they're saying that they're going to remove that loan contingency if they don't get it. They could very well be out of luck in getting their earnest money back. I don't think many people will check that, but I have seen that a few times under those conditions in very competitive circumstances. Okay. Lender limits on buyer credits. Any credit to buyer from any source for closing or other costs that is agreed to by the parties should be disclosed to the buyer's lender. If the total credit allowed by the buyer's lender is less than the contractual credit, then the contractual credit shall be reduced to the lender allowable credit, and in the absence of a separate written agreement between the parties, there shall be no automatic adjustment to the purchase price to make up for the difference between the contractual credit and the lender allowable credit. Trying to think of the best way to explain that to you.
Is that for an overpriced house or something?
No, it has to do with, remember on page 1, we said something about the seller agrees to pay so much of the buyer's closing costs. And there may be other things that a seller agrees to do for that buyer, or the buyer may ask the seller to do. And all of those actually affect the real selling price of the house. If the seller's going to pay $5,000 or $7,000 or $10,000 of the buyer's closing costs, that devalues the house by that much then, right? So the lender's looking at this thinking, if that house is really valued here but selling here because of what that seller is paying, do I really want to loan that much? Because what if that buyer defaults? He's not really putting anything down, the seller's putting it all down. So all of those are things that are going through the lending process, determining how they're going to value, and they may put a limit on what that seller can do, how much they can do for the buyer before they won't make the loan. Okay. Buyer stated financing. Seller is relying on buyer's representation of the type of financing specified, including but not limited to, as applicable, all cash amount of down payment or contingent or non-contingent loan. The seller is making a decision based upon how the offer is written and what that buyer is saying they have and what they will do. If they decide midstream to change horses, do another kind of loan, maybe not come in with as much down payment or something, that could change a lender's terms. It could make that buyer not qualified. In some particular cases, it might change what a seller would have to pay. So a seller has the right to say, I've made my decision based on what you said. If you change that, I'm not interested anymore in what you're doing because it's affecting my bottom line, it's affecting my timeline. For any number of reasons, that seller may say, I don't want to do this anymore. So a buyer has to be very sure when they make an offer that they're going to go through with what they say. I'll give you an example. We have an agent that had an investment client, professor at Fresno State, been there for many years, buys a lot of investment properties, and he usually paid cash for them. And he made an offer for a property, and it was a cash offer. And he said to his agent, I'm refinancing one of those rentals that I have. I think I'll just wait and take the money out of there rather than taking out one of the savings accounts. And I think most of his money was in a foreign bank at a very high interest rate. So he said, I'm going to wait for that refi and I'll just pay for it out of that. So the refi didn't come along as soon as they thought it would, and they had to ask for an extension. And the seller said, an extension? You said it was a cash offer. And he said, well, it is a cash offer. I'm just doing a refi. And the seller said, that wasn't what I agreed to. You said you had cash and we would close on this date. I've lost faith in you and I'm canceling the offer. And he did, just like that. So things like that actually matter. You never think much about them mattering that much, but the time value of money factors into things like that. And that seller had things he wanted to do and needed to do and couldn't do. Okay. Number 4 is sale of buyer's property. This agreement and buyer's ability to obtain financing are not contingent upon the sale of any property owned by the buyer, or this agreement and buyer's ability to obtain financing are contingent upon the sale of the property owned by the buyer, and there's a form that you submit with that then. Let me tell you it's about something. I think when you hear examples like this, it kind of rings a little truer. We had an agent, a very good agent, a really nice lady, and she worked so hard to do a good job for her people. They made an offer on a property, and they were selling a house to buy this property. The house was in escrow. Everything looked really good. It was supposed to close in, I think, less than a week from when they were making this offer. And they had no reason to think that there was any kind of jeopardy involved in making this offer. So she didn't mention it on the purchase agreement. She didn't make it contingent on that property selling. And so you know what happened. That fell apart. And to make a long story short, her buyers ended up losing their earnest money because of that. And she felt really bad. They were upset with her. She said, it looked so good, that's why I didn't put it in. I didn't think it was necessary. I wanted our offer to be stronger. It's the old thing about surprises. Nobody likes a surprise. And had she put in the form stating, we're due to close in a week, but we're still contingent, she maybe would have lost that offer to a competitive offer that didn't have a contingency like that, but she would have been in better standing with her client who lost their earnest money and could have sued her.
Right. It was more than 3 days, right?
Well,
Back out, I mean, it didn't go through.
yeah, because they probably didn't tell her what the consequences would be about that. She probably didn't even tell them that they needed to disclose that. I don't know. She's a very good, very honest person, but she made a decision to help somebody that we just can't make those kind of decisions. Everything's got to be out on the table. Okay. Number 5 is addenda and advisories. So if you have an addendum, you need to check it here. And the whole reason is because an addendum or an amendment, and it would be an addendum probably at this point, becomes a part of the contract. It's modifying something, okay? Yeah, an addendum, a lot of times you're adding something in, and we have a lot of them. We have some that have blank lines so that if the buyer or seller have something in particular they need to modify or add in, or there's some change being made. A common one that I see is the offer's been negotiated and accepted, and then there's a pest report, and the pest report shows a lot of work to be done, and the seller will say, I don't want to do this work, but I'll reduce my price by $5,000 and you can do it after the close of escrow. So I'll see an addendum, something like that, or whatever it might be. We have an extension of time addendum if there has to be a change in the timing for any reason. Maybe maybe they can close sooner, maybe they need to close later, maybe there's a delay in the loan, you need more time. Maybe the seller didn't get all of their disclosures to that buyer in time, and maybe the seller's the one asking for an extension of time so that he remains in contract, to keep the contract intact. Any of those things. And if you have that at the time that you're making the offer, then it becomes a part of it because you're naming it here. If it comes up after the purchase agreement has been negotiated and signed by everybody, and you have a ratified contract, then it still becomes a part of the agreement. And stands as a part of the agreement. So an addendum, in whatever it's modifying or adding or doing whatever, it's amending the original terms of the agreement, becomes a part of that agreement, because without it, you wouldn't know what had happened or what is happening, or you wouldn't have any changes. Okay. Okay, so the most common one could be any of those, but the one that we see checked is the buyer's inspection advisory, which comes attached, and it is a part of. Okay, other terms. If you have any other terms that will affect this agreement, this is where you write them in. They don't give you a whole lot of room to do that, but let's talk about some examples of what they might be. Maybe you've got a young person buying their first home and their parents live in LA, and they say, we want to write this offer up, we want to try to tie this property up, but I'd like to make it contingent on my folks coming up and looking at it, giving me their blessing for buying this property. And they can do that within 5 days of acceptance. So you might have a contingency like that. You could have a contingency of maybe this buyer is coming from Los Angeles to Fresno on a job transfer, and they want to make a contingency of the job transfer. If they don't get that transfer, they have no reason to buy a home in Fresno. And they'll know within a few days. So they're going to make a contingency here, contingent upon buyer receiving final job transfer approval by June 3rd, 2020, or something like that. It's good to have a time figure in there so that it's not open-ended. When you're creating your purchase agreement, you want to make them, think them through as far as possible, trying to prevent the seller from having to come back with a counter. If you said contingent upon buyer's parents checking property, and you didn't put a date on doing that by a certain date, and they waited until the 40th day on a 45-day escrow, that would not be a good thing. And you probably would get a counter back. So writing your offers up as good as you can is one of your goals. Okay. If there's any other terms, whatever it might be, and you never know what kind of a term might come into play, that would be where you would put it. Allocation of cost,
The other thing, like you wouldn't ask your sellers, like I mean, they're buying.
Yeah, you could ask them something like that. You're probably going to find out in the course of conversation while you're working with your buyers if they have something like that. But at the point that you're writing this, you could ask them, is there anything else that you can think of that could affect your purchase that we need to put in writing to protect you? And they might come up with something. I'm thinking of one that I saw one time. Somebody had a very serious illness, and they had a big medical test coming up, and they wanted to make it contingent upon the results of that test, kind of thing. So, okay, allocation of costs. We're talking here in number 7 about the kinds of allocations for costs. Who's going to pay for it, the buyer or the seller? The reason there is a place for checking either the buyer or the seller is that part of the strategy of an offer is deciding who's going to pay for something. There's really not much that says who's going to pay for what, It's for the buyer and seller to negotiate. What I'm going to give you as we go through this is what's traditional in our area. Doesn't mean it's traditional like that all over the state, because we're a big state and different areas operate a little bit differently. But I'm going to tell you how we typically do it here, but not always. Keep in mind, whether it's a buyer's market or a seller's market, a buyer may want to come in and strategize an offer to make it more attractive by appealing to the bottom line of a seller. And they can do that by saying what they're going to pay for. Keeping in mind that whoever pays for some of those things can affect their value in that property. If a buyer says, I will pay all of the seller's closing costs except commission, that might be attractive to a seller. It's going to give him a little bit, and the seller's expenses really aren't that much usually. Commission is usually the biggest thing, but maybe that would be attractive to a buyer. Maybe the buyer is doing that because they can factor in those closing costs into their the value of that property at the time that they buy it. And if they're an investor and it's an investment property, that could have some good consequences later on when you have to pay taxes. It's increasing their basis is what it's doing for an investor. Might be the same for somebody that's just buying the house to live in some instances perhaps. But strategy is a lot of what you think about as an agent, depending on the market, and to get the best thing for your buyer or seller, depending on whether it is a buyer's market or a seller's market, whether there's a lot of competition or whether there's none, that kind of thing. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So typically, where it says buyer or seller shall pay for a natural hazard zone disclosure report, including tax, environment, other, prepared by. Typically in this area, a seller pays for that NHD. We order it through escrow. If you don't put in there who that should be ordered from, prepared by, then it can come from anybody. And there are some inferior companies out there. Our company likes to use first property ID. Second would be probably Disclosure Source, which is a Fidelity property. Property ID has a $20 million E&O policy that covers agents in case they put some incorrect information in one of their reports. So we like the fact that it covers us too.
What was the second one? Disclosure.
Disclosure Source.
So it's okay.
Uh-huh. There are local companies that provide their own, and I haven't looked at one of those for a long time, but when I've looked at them in the past, I didn't see that they were giving oftentimes specific information. A good NHD is going to go APN by APN and give you information for that particular parcel, okay? Some of the companies that will give you, and a good NHD report, depending on the property, is probably going to be from about 40 to 70 pages of information that should be germane to that property. Some of these companies that have their own will give you a 5 or a 7 or a 10-page report, and it's going to have recommendations. You need to check this out, and you need to check that out, and you need to be aware of this, where it's not giving you specific information about that APN. Okay. That's one of the reasons that we like not to take the shortcut route, but those reports are paid for generally by the seller. They aren't that expensive. The most expensive ones are about $79 through Property ID or Disclosure Source. If they're getting something special, it could go up to $99. I haven't seen any over 99. But some of those discount companies, and I'll tell you who they are, they're London and Guarantee, that do their own, and they charge a whole lot less money, and they instruct their agents if they have to use their company. And those reports are about $29, $39, $49, something like that. And it was, instead of saying something specific, it will say, here's a website you need to investigate yourself. So it's making them aware, but it's not really telling them anything where they probably should be told if something affects them. As an example, what we see a lot in this area, there are flood areas and flood inundation areas, because if that dam breaks up there, that water is going to take a certain path, and it affects certain areas more than other areas. And it's kind of nice when somebody's buying a house to know if you're in the direct path of that water that's going to come down, or from another source, some flood source.
Ours is on the granite plate. We're on the granite.
Are you?
Yeah, so it's really hard to drill for water because you're on granite.
Yes. And then when it rains, you have water that collects for a while? Yeah. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing that should be disclosed. I don't really know if they do about that granite. I don't know.
When you were buying it, they disclosed that.
Oh, they did?
Yeah,
Oh, well,
that
then
was
that's good.
26 years ago.
Oh, they did?
Yeah.
Did you have an NHD 26 years ago? You must have, huh?
I
Okay.
really wasn't involved. He was. I wish I was.
Well,
Yeah, we didn't do a
interesting.
loan. We didn't do a loan, so we were.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I know none of them.
Okay. But somehow you found out about that. Okay. Good. Well, it could have been that in the TDS, the seller put it in the TDS is something that was important for you
It was
to know.
Robin, so he probably was.
Oh, it was
blinded.
new construction?
Yes.
Okay, if it was new construction, were there more than 4 homes in that area that were built at that time?
No.
Okay,
Well, I don't think so. One.
okay,
I was the third,
okay,
maybe around the corner way down.
okay. The difference is if you've got 5 or more, a subdivision of 5 or more, they have to have a special report from Sacramento. And that information could have come through a report like that. Or I think Watson is probably a pretty good builder. They maybe had some of that information and passed it on, which was the right thing to do.
And it was for the wells, you know,
Uh-huh.
some of that property out there has no water, 2 gallons.
Oh,
And so they were, you know, I always tell people, if you're gonna buy it, you better make sure there's water before you buy this.
yes, with a current report,
Yeah.
yes. Because we see from time to time that a well was drilled 20 years ago and they'll give somebody the original report, which is so far from accurate that it's just worthless, except to tell you how far down they drilled at that time, but has nothing to do with how much water is there now. Yeah. Okay. So if you don't put in the company that you want, then escrow will choose whoever they want, or the other agent will choose whoever they want. And if you have it there and it hasn't been countered in some way, they have to go with what you've got there. And we do just highly recommend that. There's a company called Snap that's in a big lawsuit because they were stealing all of their information from First American. So we don't like to deal with them because of that.
Don't use Snap
Yeah, don't use Snap. Okay.
or London
Or-
or Karen's.
Yeah. Or London, they get into the picture quite frequently, don't they? They're always in trouble. Okay. And then it says, and like I say, typically the seller pays for that as a seller expense here. And then buyer and seller shall pay for the following reports, and there's a couple of lines for that. You might have something like a pest inspection. You might have something like a roof inspection and certification. The reason that it says that we're only at this point paying for the inspections, we're not negotiating any work that may be shown on those reports at this time. If we did that, that would be like having a seller sign a blank check for something that he has no idea what's going to show up, because most of us don't know what's inside our walls or how prevalent the termites may be or the dry rot or something. It takes a professional to investigate that and give us the sad picture. But so the seller should have the right to negotiate that. Okay. Usually the pest inspections aren't too much. And usually if we're going to request a pest inspection, we'll put something like seller shall pay for pest inspection from licensed and bonded reputable company. Your pest control companies are going to be. We have a company policy that any vendors or craftspeople that we use have to be licensed and bonded. Roofers, of course, plumbers, electricians. The only group that isn't licensed is home inspectors. And they all have some kind of education that they usually get a certification from, or they may be a general contractor and they're going to be knowledgeable in that, right? There is at least one or two general contractors in the area that do home inspections, but
Would you want them?
As far as I know, they do a good job. And as far as I know, most of the home inspectors do a good job. There are different philosophies that the agents will adapt themselves about home inspections. One, and there's two. One is that home inspector is so thorough, he kills all the deals because he calls everything, and probably more than he should. And the other is that he doesn't call anything, and so that's problematic too. So find out from your fellow agents here who they use and why they like them. I think the ones that aren't good don't last long, but it kind of depends on which camp you fall into. I want some good information for my buyer, but I don't want the home inspector to kill the deal. Or I want this guy to show everything there is on this house and let the buyer decide. So it just depends. Okay. Okay, and then if there's any other kind of inspection or report, wells and septic tanks, if you are working on a country property, I would say always advise a buyer to get a septic inspection. When they do an inspection, the only way they can inspect it is to pump it. When they pump it, then they can certify it once they see it. The certification is good for that day. But at least they can look at it that day and know what condition it was in. They'll look at the leach lines too, if there's leach lines, and if they can give some estimation of longevity for any of that, they will. But a lot of times they're just saying it's in serviceable condition today or whatever. Okay. A well, there's two parts to a well test. You want a health test from a health department that's going to show any kind of bacteria, chloroform, or not chloroform.
No, arsenic.
Well, that would, yes. Oh, it's a kind of bacteria. I can't think of what I'm trying to say. Anyway, a good health report is going to show all of the aspects of that water and how healthy it is or isn't. On a well, a lot of times, it's just a matter of putting a bottle of Clorox in that well and flushing it out, and that takes care of the problem. And so it may have to be tested a time or two if there is that kind of a problem, and then it should clear up. But if it isn't, do you have a holding tank on yours?
Holding, no, I do not.
Okay. Over on the coast, it's a CDF requirement that everybody that has a well has a holding tank for fire protection.
Right, that's good. But everybody around, they do.
And so sometimes in those holding tanks, something will get inside that isn't very pleasant, like
A mouse.
yeah, something like that.
They've
I mean,
died
you've
in
got
there. Oh, God.
Then you've got a bacteria problem, but,
How are you guys doing?
What
oh,
time
we're
is it?
doing quite well. Is it time? Oh, it is time.
You're just having too much fun.
I guess we are. Okay, well, we will pick up then next week, next Tuesday, and we'll be on the bottom of page 2.
What you guys do for
We got down through the bottom of page 2.
miracle?
Uh-huh. Takes a long time to get through this purchase agreement.
Well, it's, yeah, you said 2 hours with the,
Oh,
yeah, with the buyer.
which
Yeah.
2 pages are important?
Yeah, really important.